delighted to welcome Dame Sally Davies, the Chief Medical Officer of England and the Chief Medical Advisor to the British Government, to Melbourne. So Dame Sally, you're here talking about antimicrobial resistance. In a lot of interviews you've talked about the post-antimicrobial apocalypse. What do you describe that as? How does that look to you? What's the challenge we're actually facing?
Well, when I talk about antimicrobial resistance, in effect, it's infections that don't respond to drugs, which has happened because there's been a mutation, it's natural selection. Indeed, Fleming predicted it would happen. And essentially, drug-resistant infections are rising steadily. And they're rising because we don't prevent infections well enough, because bugs, whether they're bacteria, viruses, fungi, malaria, parasites, whatever, keep building resistance, and we've not got good diagnostics that are speedy, we've not got vaccines that prevent everything, and we've not had any new classes of antibiotics come into use. We've had reformulations and better ways of using them, but no new ones since the late 80s. So they've had some decades to get used to what we use to kill them.
So what's the outcome of getting to a point where we actually can't fight with the current weapons that we have? What will the world look like? What does that actually mean in practical terms?
So at the moment, probably about 7% of people in our countries die of infections, but that's terminal cancer with an infection or something usually. And that'll go up to 40% or more. And it'll be not just, oh, you've got cancer, which makes you prone to an infection and we can't treat it. It'll be things like scratches on the face that then introduce an infection into the blood, and you die of that infection. So
what are we doing to counter this? I know you've done an awful lot of work raising the awareness of the problem, and I know that the UK government has invested fairly significant funds in addressing the issue. But what are we actually doing? What does the work look like?
Well, the world's getting steadily worse. Empty pipeline of new drugs, the drug-resistant infections death rate going up year on year, so it's at least 700,000 die every year of drug-resistant infections. If that was something else that they were dying of, we'd hear about it, wouldn't we? And that will just go higher. In Britain, because we've been working at it, we're reducing our use of antibiotics. Looking at the data in Australia, antibiotic use is high, much higher than we have in Britain, and going steadily upwards. So though you have a good strategy, you're still overusing antibiotics. And we've put in place behavioural modifications, much more education, incentives in funding to try and reduce prescribing. And that's in the human sector, let alone what we're doing in agriculture. So our chicken industry over the last 4 years has taken 71% of antibiotics out and raised protein production by 11%. So we're working in every one of the One Health areas to try and reduce antibiotic use and prevent infections.
So can we talk about the use in agriculture for a moment, because I think it's something that probably most people don't really understand, that a lot of this comes from the massive use of antibiotics in agriculture, particularly rearing of animals, obviously. And how have you been able to make that change in industry when profit is the bottom line and evidence doesn't always rank particularly highly in profit-based decisions?
Well, most human deaths are caused by overuse in the human sector at this point, but overuse in the animal sector contributes to resistance that then can impact us. So across the world, over 70% of antibiotics are used in animals, of which about 3/4 is used for growth promotion. In Europe, that's been against the law since 2006, so we have reduced steadily. But the Americans have only stopped since January 2017, the use of critical antibiotics. So you can see that people remain using too much. So how do you reduce it if it isn't by law? There's education of farmers and animal husbandry, increasing vaccinations, things like that. But very importantly are two drivers that are outside the health system. One is consumers. So the Consumer Association in the United States published a report called The Chain, and they grade fast food and multi-restaurant chains by the meat they serve and the antibiotic use of the meat producers. So that has had a dramatic impact because you've got Subway quite close to the top, because they don't buy chicken, beef or pork from people who use antibiotics for growth promotion. So consumer pull is important, and we're getting some of that now in Britain building up. And investor pull can be very important. I was at an investors conference talking to 300 investors a couple of months ago saying, you should not invest in companies that misuse antibiotics. That is not part of your social responsibility. So I think you can get at it in all sorts of ways.
Multifactorial.
Yeah.
So back to the work that you're doing. I read recently that you were sort of spearheading a campaign, a $10 million campaign out of the UK government to encourage researchers to do work on new antibiotics and resistant strains. What's the thinking behind that, engaging the research community? How critical is that, and what other ways are you going about it?
We need new science, we need new innovation. In prevention and in treatment. And actually our government over the last 4 or 5 years has spent more than £367 million on research, some of it through our research councils, who've been doing some beautiful cross-disciplinary work, a lot around behaviour as well, but quite a bit, 50 million in an AMR innovation fund, and so we've just announced a call with Canada for different ways of either improving growth without antibiotics in animal husbandry or vaccines, for instance, for fish farming. So doing that, but we're also partnered with China, spending £22.5 million on looking at their traditional medicines and have they got new antibiotics and antibacterials and things. So we're funding in all sorts of areas.
Is one of the issues that antibiotics are not the sexy new thing, that researchers, that drug companies aren't interested, or is there something deeper? Why haven't we had new antibiotics or new classes of antibiotics since the 80s? What's the root of that?
So we've got two problems. The first is the low-hanging fruit was taken by the late 80s. The second is a market failure, and it's an economic market failure. We pay very little for antibiotics. We don't expect to pay much, and if you look at the price of a course of antibiotics, it's in terms of pounds as compared with double-digit thousands of pounds for a new cancer drug or something. So how do you change that and rectify it? Indeed, it's become so bad that some of the old antibiotics, well off patent, are difficult to get hold of because all the companies have consolidated because there's no money in it.
Which is a sort of a definition of a wicked problem, really. And is the work that the UK government has done to encourage people to move back into this area, is it enough? What do we need to do to change that tide? Is there more that we could do? I'm sure there must be.
There has to be, because we haven't got there yet. I'm very worried about it. So I asked our Prime Minister, the former one, Cameron, to commission an independent review from a well-known economist, and Jim O'Neill did it. He used to be the chief economist at Goldman Sachs, and he laid out very beautifully all the problems and the need to de-link the research costs in finding targets and new drugs from volume of sales and the price, so that we would get new antibiotics and antimicrobials, but we could look after them, steward them, be very careful with them, and the companies would get their money either as prizes or some other market entry reward, so that we didn't have to get them getting money by piling them high and selling them cheap, which drives more resistance. The Americans have just a couple of weeks ago announced that they're, and it's cross-party and cross-house, that they're going to try out in this area a transferable patent voucher for 12 months. And that might crack it and do it. But in Europe, we need to do more.
One of the challenges that you've talked about is prescribing of antibiotics and also people being prescribed, certainly probably more commonly in developing countries, too low a level of antibiotics, people not finishing their course. What's the role of individual GPs, clinicians, pharmacists in addressing this problem?
So if you don't want resistance, you want to give a good dose of a drug for long enough to kill the bug. So underdosing, either because they're counterfeit drugs so that there's only a trace of the antibiotic in it, and antibiotics are the most common counterfeit drug across the world, or because in poor countries people can only buy 1 or 2 days so that they don't get long enough to kill them, drives more resistance. So there's that problem. And then there's the problem that in Britain we know that about 1 in 5 antibiotic prescriptions in the community is not actually needed. And I can tell you that the research in Australia suggests it's probably higher than that, the overprescription levels. We need to use antibiotics when they're needed. We should not use them when they're not.
So it was part of the problem there that the general public think an antibiotic will fix whatever is wrong with them. I've got a cold, an antibiotic will fix it. And clinicians don't say no.
Absolutely, and because viruses get better on their own, if you take an antibiotic, how do you know it wasn't the antibiotic?
So one of the challenges that we have in Victoria that is replicated across the developed world is an issue around demand management, an issue around certainly our acute health systems being massively over capacity in most places. If what you're talking about comes true, that is only going to get worse. What do hospital leaders in Victoria, but also elsewhere, what do they do to manage that issue? How do we ensure that this is taken seriously and that challenge around demand management, which this will inevitably make more difficult, is brought to the surface? How do we ensure people take that really seriously?
Well, it's surprising if the hospitals aren't, because there's quite a bit of data now about how if you have drug-resistant infections, it increases the morbidity, mortality, and therefore cost. I, in Britain, talk about it doubles the length of stay and doubles the mortality and doubles the cost. So it's in everyone's interests to reduce the incidence of drug-resistant infections. You have to start with knowing what you've got and really good surveillance. We have national point prevalence studies every year. That gives us a very good picture. I don't know whether you have that and whether the hospitals have good surveillance. But then, attached to the surveillance, you've got to have very careful antibiotic stewardship programs. Are people using antibiotics when they're needed? Are they using the right antibiotics? Ideally, in your hospitals, if you've got electronic prescribing, at 36 to 48 hours, the initial prescription of a broad-spectrum antibiotic will be stopped, and a flag will come up and say, now you have to find out if the patient did grow anything from their blood cultures or urine, and change to the right antibiotic, because a lot of overuse in hospitals is just continuation of antibiotics, laziness. They're never checked, they're never stopped. So there's all of that. And then we find in Britain we seem to have to, every 5 to 10 years, re-educate the health service totally on hand washing and how to do it obsessionally to reduce MRSA and general infections. So it's, as always, complex, whole system and multiple approaches.
What would you say to the Victorian or Australian governments if you were trying to sell to them the importance of antimicrobial resistance and the response to it? What are the key actions you would suggest governments should take based on your experience in the UK and also with the WHO? What should they be doing?
So I'd talk about the cost to them already and how it's going to get worse. And then I would push hand washing and infection prevention and control. Are children going through their vaccination programs effectively? Because, and other people at risk. And it may be, say, the pneumococcal vaccine, which saves pneumococcal infections, so you don't need treatment with antibiotics, or the flu vaccines, because if you don't get flu, you're less likely to get a superimposed infection. But it is important we deal with it. It's not just the cost. We risk losing modern medicine, cancer treatments, replacement, joints, caesarean sections, all need vast amounts of antibiotics to prevent infections or treat them. So they do need to think about it and have plans. And you can get into the behavioural things like we have. So one of the experiments we tried was a letter to half of the top 20% of general practice prescribers, just saying from me to them, you're in the top 20% of prescribers. I did get a postbag of irate doctors, but overall, prescribing came down. We've tried financial incentives to hospitals, and that's been quite successful. So there are different ways of approaching it, and I would try all of them.
Absolutely. One of the things you talk about a lot is the importance of evidence-basing treatment, models of care, policy. One of the reflections that I would have about trying to ingrain that idea of evidence-based once it leaves academia and moves into the public policy frame is that often your decision makers will run in the opposite direction as soon as they hear that someone's going to explain what the evidence says in detail. And I talk to a lot of academics who get very frustrated by the fact that the policymakers don't just want to lap up the research that they've done and act on it. How do you, in your role working with senior politicians, get past it's evidence-based to this is what the evidence means, this is what you should do about it, without them running in the other direction?
Well, I think the problem for academics is that they're always interested in the latest study, either that they've done or someone else has, whereas I think if you want to change policy, it's rarely an individual study, it's usually a meta-analysis and a review. So I'd like to know that I'm basing it on a body of evidence first, but you have to frame things to policymakers and politicians in a way that they can understand. And so it's not banging on about, look, I've done this and this is what it shows. It's, you have a problem and this is the way to approach it, which is backed up by evidence.
Can you talk a little bit about the work that you've done on the international stage around antimicrobial resistance, your work with the WHO, your work with the United Nations, and how that's developing, and how it differs from the work you might do within the UK in your day-to-day job?
So part of my role is to be the UK's person on the WHO's executive board. And I felt that we needed to take antimicrobial resistance to the board and the World Health Assembly and get a resolution to do something about it. But when I started to do that, I was told, but that won't make any difference, we've had a few. So I said, all right, what we need to do is get the World Health Assembly to agree a global action plan so that every country would go and build its national action plans that would all come together in a global action plan. And I persuaded the former Director General to get me to chair a strategic technical advisory group to help them develop that. But in order to get that to happen, I discovered it wasn't just a group of doctors deciding, it gets into politics. So I am the Chief Medical Officer, not for the Department of Health, but for the UK government. So I went to our Foreign Office and said, I need your help, I need diplomacy. So then the diplomats came into the subject and started to work with other countries. The Netherlands and Sweden were particularly supportive and helpful. Chris Bagley, your former Chief Medical Officer, played a key role. And so that then brought together a coalition of willing countries. Having done that, we got the Global Action Plan through that. Our ambassador in Rome to the Food and Agriculture Organization got it through there, but the same countries came in and helped. And then we got it through the Organization for Animal Health. Then we sat down as countries and said, so yes, but it's One Health, and actually we don't think that WHO, FAO are doing enough, and environment's involved. So how do we get a greater focus? And I said, let's go to the UN and have a high-level meeting. So then, again, we worked as a coalition of countries to take it to the UN, and our diplomats played a massive role, both out of our mission in New York, but also Geneva, working into different countries. And our Foreign Office does a wonderful job on this, and have been joined by our aid agency, DFID, who also now put AMR into all their major grants and their work with low and middle income countries. So it's become a priority in our foreign policy for us to work with other countries to push it in country and at the global level. And of course that was helped because I asked for it to go onto the government's risk register, and we went through that process. So you have pandemic flu at the top of the risk register, then you have terrorism and AMR. So it's a priority for the whole of government.
It's interesting talking about international cooperation on health, because there was recently a situation around breastfeeding, with the WHO having an interesting political situation arise around the support for breastfeeding versus use of formula when it's not necessary, and commentators saying if you can't get cooperation on health internationally, how can you get cooperation on anything else? Thank you very much for spending this time with us this morning. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Australia, and I hope very much to be able to talk to you again, because I could talk to you all day.
Thank you. I look forward to returning.
Thank you.